And broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny, sometimes Colorado. So, a question has come up recently, and we get asked it from time to time. And it's the question of whether we would participate or build or enable this concept of vaccine passports. And this is something that has come up in the blockchain space because several people in the space are actively working on these documents, and there's a lot of concerns about them. So it's a complicated topic, like many things are. And there already are a notion of vaccine passports, vaccine booklets. I travel to Africa all the time, and a lot of countries I go to require yellow fever vaccines, for example. A lot of family in the healthcare industry, they need to be vaccinated for the flu, hepatitis, and other such things. And these are usually occupationally required. The big concern behind vaccine passports is that they're being extended significantly beyond the initial scope and concern. So normally vaccine passports in the legacy sense are used for entry into a country, or they're used for working within a specific domain, for example, in a hospital setting or a clinical setting. The concern now is that there are many nations discussing using vaccine passports as a criteria for public life, going to a restaurant, going to a nightclub, going to a coffee shop, attending a concert, any public gathering, citing public health concerns. And while in the short term, there may be some perhaps small to moderate health benefits for such things, my deep concern is that such infrastructure, if it is used to restrict the freedom of movement and be a denial mechanism, will inevitably be reused by those who have more totalitarian thoughts for other purposes. For example, perhaps if you don't pay your taxes, you're no longer allowed to have entry. Perhaps if your credit score is too low, like in China with the social credit scheme, that you're no longer allowed to have entry or be part of public life. Or maybe they can come up with all kinds of other exotic tests. If you haven't taken certain sensitivity or cultural training, you're not allowed to enter. And as crazy as that seems, there are some physicians within the United States who feel that racism is apparently a bigger threat than the pandemic, which is why there was a letter of over 1,000 physicians signed saying that the BLM protests, even though they could spread COVID, should not be stopped, whereas other protests should be stopped because the threat of racism was apparently greater. So why wouldn't they advocate then for critical race theory training as a condition for entry into buildings or not? If you're arguing a public health demand or a public safety demand, you can begin reusing that infrastructure for any purpose. We call this the infrastructure of tyranny. It is very difficult to predict how people 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years are going to use the system. And so you have to understand if those systems are constrained by some process like constitutional law or federal law, or are they constrained by the whims and wills of the leaders that stand behind those systems? For example, in the country of Afghanistan, there's a huge crisis that's ongoing where people who thought the Taliban had been defeated were starting to live the life of moderation. So instead of wearing beards and covering their faces and showing themselves to be nothing but pious, they were showing themselves to be like us, going out and enjoying a sunny day, going to the pool, drinking, having fun with friends, and taking pictures of that, recording that, putting it up on social media. Now, 20 years later, the unthinkables happened. The Taliban is back in control of Afghanistan. And the very same social networks, the very same digital activities that they took for granted, believing that these were safe, are now being used against them to decide who should be punished up into execution. So it's a horrible reality that millions of people now suffer and face. So we as a company are very careful about the systems we construct, the values behind those systems, and we always ask what constrains them. One of the things that's completely missed by Paulson and by Krugman and many of these former legacy system people who criticize Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency industry is the social immutability behind the terms and conditions of cryptocurrencies. Whether you like them or not, or they're useful to you or not, or they're a negative or positive for your particular business or lifestyle, the terms and conditions and rules of their operation and use of their operation are known upfront, and they will not be changed because they're inconvenient to a particular actor or regime. We don't have that in any sense of the word for a vaccine passport system. And it is my belief that should these systems become propagated, they will be misused and mishandled well beyond their original intent to slow down or stop a pandemic, and start being used for whatever the political pet project of the particular regime happens to be. And every few years, they'll radically change in one direction or the other direction because it's simply too tempting to have complete control over the freedom of movement of the citizens of the country and be able to connect that to desired social outcomes. So we as a company will not work on these systems unless and until we feel that the systems are constrained with the same social immutability and clarity of purpose that cryptocurrencies are. And nothing I have seen on the market would indicate that they couldn't be misused for tyranny. And that's a deep concern of mine. So I just wanted to make a quick video to kind of put a flag in the ground about where we stand, our values as a company. We really do want to change the world for the better, and we care very deeply about public health, and we care very deeply about ensuring that people are safe. And we also care very deeply about your rights, your privacy, your systems that you live in. And to us, it matters a lot that things you are promised are not misused and mishandled. We tend to be lied to a lot these days by many institutions, the media especially so. We tend to be told one thing, and then it turns out that that thing wasn't true. I remember growing up as a teenager, I was told again and again that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. That was a lie. It was a known lie within the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. military, and they eventually admitted it. None were found that were sizable or significant. No one went to jail for that. Trillions of dollars were spent. Probably 500,000 or more people were killed or injured, and a lot of bad happened as a consequence of that lie. Yet, for some reason, we just moved on. That's not the only lie that's been told from time to time or bait and switch that's happened. The Patriot Act was, for example, pushed out as a temporary measure to ensure America's safety and security in this war on terrorism. 2 decades later, we have more intelligence agencies, the biggest spy state humanity's ever constructed, and no end in sight to these temporary provisions. If we are, as a society, to admit an artifact that severely restricts our travel and our entry into businesses we used to have the freedom of movement into, without any clear understanding of who's in control and under what conditions can they do that, then there's no reason why such things would not be abused. Just as we have witnessed in the past 2 decades, abuse and abuse and abuse and abuse and abuse. The world is a dangerous place. Just by living, we all take risks every single day, and we accept those risks. It's just the reality of being human. If you go out in a rainstorm, a thunderstorm, there's a small risk of being struck by lightning. You get in a car, there's a small risk of an accident. While driving to work today, there was a rather severe accident on the road that I drove by. Had I left home 5 minutes earlier, pretty good chance I would have been involved in it. These things happen every time we get on a plane or a helicopter, every time that we do anything. Anytime you shake someone's hand, there's always a risk associated with that. Part of life is having the ability to quantify risk and understand it and understand what is significant and what isn't. We rely, for the most part, upon institutions to assist us in that. We rely, for the most part, upon some deliberative body that thinks about these things. For example, every day, most of you get up, pour yourself a cup of water, and you drink water, either out of bottle or out of the faucet, out of your refrigerator. How do you know the water that you drink is safe? The people in Flint, Michigan, they trusted an institution that let them down. Live here in Colorado, and so far it's okay. Some of you don't trust the institutions, which is why you have atmospheric water generators or reverse osmosis filters, because you say, I don't think these people are credible. And certainly every time I travel to Africa, I bring with me filter bottles, a UV filter bottle and a reverse osmosis bottle. because I can't trust those institutions because historically they've proven to be unreliable and unaccountable. It is unfortunate that we live in a world where we can't quite get to honesty yet. The best we can do is be honest with each other and set our principles out there and accept the consequences that sometimes it's not optimal. And I don't know about you, but I'm getting real tired of every dimension and element of our lives being controlled by a single disease. The human race has endured this before. Look at the history of Europe and the Black Death, or the plague of Justinian, or what Marcus Aurelius had to live through, which led to the decline, ultimately the destruction of the Roman Empire. It's been a fact of human reality that disease goes hand in hand with human experience. There's an apex, and then eventually we recover and move on. United States, we dealt with the Spanish flu, for example, right on the back of World War I. We have great tools, great medicine, great people, and heroes in healthcare who every single day fight hard. We, for some reason, think now that stepping to the precipice, that instituting a device that restricts our ability to go to the coffee shop, go to the restaurant, is somehow the only way out of something that we don't have to. We can naturally get out of it through vaccinations and infections. Eventually, we'll get there. This disease is no different in that respect. And it's a big policy decision. All I can do is warn people about the consequences of it being misused and at least ask for some checks and balances and controls to be put in. And as a company, refuse to work on these systems until such a time that reasonable checks and balances are put into place and oversight is put into place and people are held accountable, especially if these systems are mishandled and misused. Now, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. Many of you know that early in the pandemic, I was able to get the Pfizer vaccine, and perhaps at some point I'll get a booster shot, but maybe I probably already got the Delta variant. I get exposed to so many people, and the reality is statistics clearly show the vast majority of people who are vaccinated do not get hospitalized or die from COVID. And if I'm exposed to Delta, for the most part, in my age group and health category, I wouldn't even notice it. Or if I did, it would be a week affair at most. It's not true for everyone, but that's the public health reality that I face. Boosters will inevitably be here and likely will be mixed in at some point with the influenza vaccine and become a fact of life. And those who are vulnerable will get vaccinated on a yearly basis. COVID will never go away. This is why I'm very concerned about infrastructure to fight COVID, because it's not like some sort of bacterial infection that we can somehow, like the Black Death, treat. This is a respiratory virus. Humans have never defeated respiratory viruses, ever in the history of medicine. Coronaviruses have been floating around for a long time. Influenza has been floating around for a long time. They're not going away. It's going to continue to mutate, and eventually variants will become strains, and they will break through general vaccine immunity. Now, we can keep making vaccines, and we will. But to say that now, as a condition of freedom, this particular disease is so serious that you can't enter places, then we beg, why don't we demand this of tuberculosis or other conditions, which are certainly threatening and communicable? I just don't think free society should live this way or think this way, and it deeply concerns me. And I think we've reached the point where the crisis is averted. Yes, ICUs are still being filled. Occasionally, that happens during flu pandemics as well. And yes, there are certain groups that are having difficulty. But let's be exceedingly clear here. Amongst the vaccinated, for the most part, COVID is no longer a significant threat, including the variants that have come. If you doubt me, you go take a look at the breakthrough cases that the CDC archives, and the numbers clearly demonstrate that. And we're ahead of most of these things with booster shots and other such things and other treatments. This is not January of 2020 anymore. We're on the other side of it. And now it's more of a situation of the developing world and the lack of access to vaccines, vaccine equality in this particular respect. And there's been numerous policy decisions which could have been far more meaningful than a vaccine passport program in slowing the spread. For example, it still is inconceivable to me that Novavax is not on market. It's also inconceivable to me that when governments, the largest purchasers of these things, they didn't use collective bargaining power to force a buy one, get one free program for every developed world vaccine to also purchase a developing world vaccine. Just the purchases of Canada, the United States, the European Union alone could have guaranteed access to over 3 billion doses for Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. As these vaccines were paid for by the taxpayers, as these vaccines were developed through taxpayer money, and as these vaccines are given sovereign immunity, the immunity to being sued, it seems entirely reasonable to put such a demand for humanitarian reasons. And if a pharmaceutical company is unwilling to do that, to publicly shame them for taking advantage of the suffering of others. This was not done. Yet the very same leaders who've decided not to do this, which would have had a much more meaningful and significant slowdown on the pandemic, especially the emergence of variants, are now telling us that we need to institute a system that restricts our freedom of access and movement and try to make that system as global as possible and not tell us what the terms and conditions are on it. That makes me very skeptical and very concerned. And this is a turning point in humanity, whether we continue to become more free and open or if we regress to totalitarianism. And the choice is ours, what we accept and what we don't accept. And we can't be afraid to speak our minds, because if we are, that's an indication that we're already on the other side of the rainbow. And I don't want to live there. So thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.